Hello, SGS 101 students. Welcome to your second video lecture of SGS 101. We are wrapping up our first module in which we're understanding what is a state and what is a democracy, very fundamental to understanding global politics. And so the slides today are going to answer the question, how do markets, states, and individuals interact with more detail than we went through on Tuesday during class. So the key concepts we're going to cover today are habitation, which means living in a place. Two, improvement. Three, symmetry. Four, centricity. And five, reciprocity. So these are key ideas within global affairs and international relations. And if you remember from Tuesday, we went over what sovereignty is and what it means for a government to be legitimate. And some of the topics that we covered is that the definition of sovereignty is a country's right to self-govern or make its own decisions within its own physical geographic borders. And for a government to be legitimate, it has to be recognized by other states so that it can engage in interactions. And a legitimate government typically has support from a large number of its own populace. And if a government does not have any support from its own populace, it tends to not be legitimate. So today we are continuing our discussion of markets and political systems, and in particular, the relationship between markets and democracy as a form of representation. So, state and global markets, part one. To ground this discussion, we're going to start with some ideas from Karl Polanyi in The Great Transformation, very, very famous economist. And Polanyi's core claim is that deceptively simple but extremely powerful, which is markets are not natural. That is what Polanyi is arguing, that markets do not come about on their own by any means. He is arguing that they don't emerge spontaneously if governments simply get out of the way. Instead, markets are political constructs. They depend on laws, they depend on regulation or deregulation, enforcement, and social norms. So, Polanyi's argument is important because for many, many years, social scientists assumed that economic systems were an organic, naturally occurring phenomenon across all cultures, across all of human history. And Polanyi walks in to the discussion and he says, no, there's nothing natural about economies. They are all political and to some degree artificial constructs. So, in other words, here are the key ideas. Markets require states. Again, I'll say it again. Economic markets require states. Polanyi was reacting to the idea of the self-regulating market, the belief that if you remove political interference, markets will naturally organize society in the most efficient way. He argued that this belief was historically false and also socially dangerous. So if you recall, if you took a lower level economics course at ASU, or if you remember from economics in high school, the idea of laissez-faire, or the French term for hands-off, let's not meddle with markets and they'll take care of themselves. Polanyi is making the opposite argument that there is no self-regulating market. When markets are disembedded from society, meaning disconnected, labor, land, and money are treated purely as commodities. Societies tend to experience, according to Polanyi, instability, inequality, and backlash. So he's arguing that if you don't regulate economy, instability, inequality, and backlash are going to happen among the populace. And historically, that backlash often produces stronger state intervention and not less. So, Polanyi gives us our first key insight, and that's this. Markets are always embedded in political and social institutions, whether we acknowledge it or not. That is his main point. And he wrote in The Great Transformation that the modern market economy and the modern nation state create a single human intervention called the market society. That's his term. It hasn't taken off, but he's associated with the term market society, which is this idea that societies and politics and economics are inherently intertwined. And then the very famous anthropologist Malinowski pushed forward the idea of social networks, which means reciprocity, back and forth. Anthropologists love to study reciprocity in societies. Redistribution, the idea that a state takes in resources and then gives them back out to people in a different way than it collected them. And then households, as an anthropologist, Malinowski agrees with this, but he argues that it's social networks that lead to the need for the state to regulate economic marketplaces. So this is a lot of big words. We can talk about this more in class next week if you need to, but some examples to prove that economies and markets don't exist on their own. They have to be embedded in society and politics is after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when the USSR collapsed, a lot of economic intervention around the world was meant for shock therapy and to try to shock these post-Soviet country economies into growth again. And it worked in some sorts of places like Poland, China, and Vietnam. And the idea is that the shock of the end of communism would lead to growth of new businesses, a new market economy. And that tends to be true. And so the growth of and the rise in income of former Soviet countries is proof, or I wouldn't say proof, it is evidence indicating that Polignani is right, that market economies can only exist as a reflection of society and politics. That's a little complicated. I hope you got it. So this brings us to a set of assumptions that many people, especially kind of in the 1990s after the Soviet Union had collapsed, took for granted. And one of those assumptions, how do I say this? One assumption is that democracies naturally produce healthier, more efficient markets. And another is that markets themselves generate democracy over time. So these assumptions shaped policies like privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization. Again, really big words. Privatization just means the government is in charge of less services and private companies are in charge of more services. Deregulation, and that means governments are not putting lots of rules out there for how the economy works. Deregulating means you give the economy more freedom to do what it wants. And trade liberalization, which means a country is willing to trade with lots of new partners and is very open-minded about new trade arrangements. And these are often packaged together as what we call free market reforms. And after the Cold War, across the globe, the logic was pretty straightforward. The idea was that, okay, communism lost, democracy won. This is all about circa 1989 when the USSR ended. And the idea across the globe was that democracy creates good institutions, and good institutions create efficient markets. And markets create a middle class, and a middle class creates democracy. If you can imagine all of that kind of on a spectrum of one step leading to another. Democracy leads to good institutions create efficient markets create a middle class, and then a middle class creates democracy. And that was the idea of how we were going to help former Soviet countries in the 1990s. which led to a whole body of research on, do democratic countries enjoy healthier markets? And that's the question. This is the assumption we had in the 90s, and then political scientists said, hey, maybe we should test this. So if you look at this slide now, do democratic countries enjoy healthier markets? Empirically, which means based on evidence that we can see, the relationship between democracy and economic performance, like how fast GDP rises, is really messy. And it's way messier than a lot of people's assumptions in the 1990s suggest. Because some democracies grow very quickly. Other democracies stagnate, meaning there's no change and they can't really manage to become more democratic. And then some authoritarian systems collapse economically, while other authoritarian systems grow at extraordinary rates. So there's no automatic relationship between regime type and market success. So, is democracy good for an economy? Lots of times, probably yes, but not always. What seems to matter more than whether a country is democratic is the state's capacity. That means the strength of the state, or how much can a government do for its people. And state capacity is measured by, as I mentioned in class, the ability to collect taxes, the ability to enforce laws and enforce contracts, the ability, number three, to regulate markets and to control your economy. And then the fourth marker of state capacity is your ability to manage social conflict. So, collecting taxes, enforcing rules, regulating your economy, and managing social conflict are testaments to a state capacity. And state capacity is what determines economic outcomes, not necessarily the degree of democracy. A weak democracy with low state capacity can struggle to sustain markets, and a strong centralized state, even a non-democratic one, China, may be able to guide its own markets very effectively. So this creates a puzzle for our theories, and that puzzle is what we're going to explore next. So on this slide, we are going to consider the fact that maybe in some contexts, democracy can hurt a fledgling country, and maybe to build up an economy, that fledgling country can have a form of governance other than democracy. It's prove its economy, and then maybe with an improved economy, it will become more democratic. This is very messy. I agree. So if any of you who have taken political philosophy have probably read about Plato. And when we're thinking about the relationship between democracy and how healthy an economy is, we can think about how Plato warned us of mass rule within a democracy, saying that contemporary critics of democracy can claim authoritarian regimes while fast tracking economic programs. And then when we consider this question, my favorite African economist is Darren Acemoglu. I've never said his name smoothly, but I've read all of his work. And in his studies, he found vast gains in productivity, basically improved economies after countries democratized. And his explanation was that they employ broad-based investment, especially in health and human capital, which is lacking in authoritarian states. So Plato is telling us, don't get excited about democracy and its ability to fix economies. But Acemoglu is telling us, yes, we should be excited about the ability of democracy to improve economies. So I'm just giving you an array of ideas so that you can weigh which idea you want to put more weight into. So we are now going to watch a really interesting video about why is it if people in the 1990s were arguing that we just had to spread democracy across former Soviet Union and that democracy improves economies. How do we explain China? The fastest rising economy in the world. It's essentially an economic miracle that no political economist could have ever foreseen. But yet, we all know China is not a democracy. So, therefore, what does China tell us about the relationship between democracy and economic growth?
Without understanding the institution left over from the Cultural Revolution, people would not understand China's economic reform because the whole thing started from the inherited institutions from the Cultural Revolution. So here the key is really regionally decentralized totalitarian system in the sense that all the local governments, all the different levels of local governments have the resources and control what they are going to do. My name is Chenggang Xu. I'm a professor of economics at CKGSB, which is a private business school in China. When people claim that the rise of China is the biggest event in the recent economic history in the world, the qualification is the following. If we look at the issues from the point of view of the total GDP, so within 30 years, in terms of a growth rate of total GDP, China has break the record. And then the other issue is the other qualification is poverty relief. So within this 30 years of time, the largest poverty relief happened in China. So that is a very important issue. And then the third aspect is the relative economic development. The so-called relative economic development is measured by the per capita GDP compared with the world frontier. So for example, if we take the United States per capita GDP as world frontier, then comparing with the world frontier from the beginning of this 30 years to the end of this 30 years, so what is the change level? So actually, these three aspects are closely related. Number one issue is the population of China. So given China is the most populous nation, given the size of population, and then once you have a fast relative economic growth, the growth of relative economic development, and then you have this total GDP increase. So these are intimately related. And another intimately related issue is that at the very beginning of the Chinese economic reform, China was one of the poorest nations. So this is actually a key point. So when the reform started, if we are talking about relative economic development level, China was about something like 1/20th of the US level. So that's significantly below the level of the average Africa per capita GDP. We are talking about such a very, very low level. So it's desperately poor. So starting from this very low level, and then after 30 years, nowadays the Chinese relative development level is close to 1/4 of the US level. So started from 1/20th up to nearly 1/4. So in that sense, it's a huge change. So if we only look at these factors, then yes, this is the biggest event in economic history. But some other claims are without the qualification can be exaggerations. So when people talk China as a superpower, for example, if we look at the per capita GDP level, it's less than 1/4 of the US level. So if we compare China with the Soviet Union at its peak time, Soviet Union was significantly more than 1/3 of the U.S. per capita GDP level. So China is still below that level. We have to keep in mind in our understanding. And also, when we talk about this growth rate, the key point is that the starting point was very, very low. That's terribly important. So without understanding that, talking about the rise of China can be misleading. So because at the beginning, China was so weak, so poor, so in general, the whole national economy is at a poverty level. So when we talk about this growth achievement in China in the recent 4 decades, we always associate with the economic reform. So why reform? So this is the key issue, actually. So at the beginning of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese per capita GDP level relative to the US level was 1 of the 20th. When the reform started, the level is about the same. The relative development level is slightly higher, but it's so marginal. So basically, we could ignore that. So in 1950, the level was 5% of the US level. In 1980, it was 6% of the US level. So basically, there was no substantial change in the first 30 years of the People's Republic of China. So then, why reform is so important? It's so clear that before the reform, basically there's no catch-up. And also, we know that what happened before the economic reform. So there were 2 disastrous movements. One is the Great Leap Forward movement, and the other is the Cultural Revolution. So reform means no Great Leap Forward movement, no Cultural Revolution, and the whole way of organizing the economy has to be changed. So there is a sort of a misleading explanation about China, saying that China was a centrally planned economy and then changing to a market economy. This is not quite accurate. The so-called centrally planned economy, usually by describing in this way, implies the Soviet model. China, since 1950, when China established this People's Republic of China, established this system, they fully implemented or copied the Soviet model. But since 1958, China has changed the institution. So it's no longer a Soviet type of centrally planned economy anymore. So the institution has been changed, the centrally planned being abandoned. So it becomes a administratively planned, but not centrally planned economy. So I characterize that kind of system as a regionally decentralized totalitarian system, because in the political economy, the Soviet system is described as a totalitarian system. China changed that a little bit in terms of administration. So although the whole economy, the overall society is governed in a totalitarian way, but in terms of administration, in terms of resource allocation, is regionally decentralized in the sense that the local governments control substantial amount of resources and they manage their local economies. So based upon this institution, so there are 2 waves of changing from the Soviet system into this kind of a Chinese type of administratively planned economy, which I called regionally decentralized totalitarian system. So based upon this kind of institution, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, the economic reform started. Then in the earlier decades of the economic reforms, the major strategy is regional competition. So this so-called regional competition is qualitatively different from market competition. Here, the competition is not in the sense of a profit maximization. It's not in the sense of competition in the market. Instead, these are a sort of a tournament competition that the local governments are ranked. So they compete for ranking. They compete to become number one. So for example, within a city, you have several, about 10 counties, and the counties within the city, they wanted to become number one. They compete for the number one position. And within a province, you are going to have roughly about 10 cities, and each city they are competing each other. They want to be the number one in the province. And in the whole nation, you have a little bit more than 30 provincial level regions. They compete each other as well. And here the key issue is what are the targets of the competition? So at the earlier stages of the economic reform, the competition target is GDP growth rate. And turns out this is a very effective approach in terms of promoting the economic reform and growth. So this is how the reform is associated with growth, or growth is associated with reform. Because in order to grow, the regional governments have to find their way. So to grow actually is a big challenge. How to grow? This is a big challenge. So at the very beginning of the reform, there were lots of emphasis on the reform of the state sectors. But turns out that is not working well. That didn't work well. And the first successful reform was in agriculture. Actually, it involves the land reform. It's a partial privatization. Partial means there's no fundamental change in ownership, but the using rights have been privatized. So with using rights and also the exchange of using rights, these are privatized. So based upon that, there is a sort of industrial revolution in the sense of the rural industrial development. So at a very early stage of the economic reform, most of the growth actually occurred in this area, the so-called township village enterprises. Starting from a very low base up to the mid-1990s, the largest sector is this sector in the whole Chinese economy. And that actually is also the base for the private sector when the private sector became partially legalized in the 1990s. So then in the whole 1990s and early 21st century, China had a very rapid growth of the private sector from zero to nowadays is more than half of the GDP being produced by the private sector. So if we look at the Chinese constitution, both the state constitution and the party's constitution, then we find that by constitutions, party constitution and the state constitution, private sector was not allowed until 2002, the change of party's constitution, and 2004, the change of the state constitution. So until the early 21st century, private sector was not legal. However, up to that point, the private sector was already half of the GDP. So if we are talking about the so-called China miracle, what is the miracle? This is the miracle.
That was really intriguing. So I think based on this video, China's experience complicates almost every simple assumption we have discussed about how democracy fuels economic growth. And it shows that markets can grow rapidly without democratic institutions, but also that those markets are deeply shaped by state power. So you just heard that one way that China had an economic miracle was creating a sense of competition among its own provinces in terms of, for example, agricultural production. That is a really novel approach to increasing your GDP without looking to outside countries, just relying on your own domestic labor force. So, all of this doesn't mean that China is a model to be replicated everywhere. By no means am I saying that. It means that markets are not politically neutral, and it means that they don't automatically produce liberal democracy, which was the narrative that economists had in the early 1990s with the USSR. So, if we go back to thinking about Polanyi, who I discussed at the beginning of our lecture, China actually reinforces Polanyi's core argument. Markets don't exist outside politics, and markets are embedded in state institutions, legal systems, and power structures. The difference across countries is not whether markets are political, it's how they're political. They're always political. In some cases, markets are embedded in democratic institutions, for example, in most of Europe. And in other countries, they are embedded in authoritarian ones. A good example of that is Gulf Arab states. So here are some questions to consider. You don't, these are rhetorical since this is a video lecture, but we do have some big takeaways. First, markets are politically constructed and they require states. Second, democracy does not automatically produce healthier markets, although it tends to in general, kind of. And markets do not automatically produce democracy, although they might help democracy along. And then third, what matters most is state capacity. How strong is the state? Sequencing, at what time does the economy take off relative to changes in leadership? And then lastly, institutional design and not ideology alone are what determines the robustness of a market in relation to the political structure. All right. I hope that's cleared up. And I will see you. Ignore Thursday at 10:30. That is from the prior semester. Thank you all so much for your attention.